Have you ever imagined opening the passport of a missing tourist and finding inside a handwritten message in dark, almost dry ink that said, "I told you not to come here"? Now imagine this wasn't the first or the last. Each new disappearance brought another document, another cryptic phrase, another reminder that someone was hunting people who simply wanted to see the world. No one noticed the pattern at first. Authorities blamed it on accidents, lost travel, or travel mix-ups. But when the fourth tourist disappeared, they all had something in common: marked passports. It was as if the killer wanted to talk to his investigators, as if each death were a letter left to be read by anyone who dared get too close. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. This case isn't just another one among many involving little-known serial killers. It reveals how human curiosity, the desire to explore, to cross borders, can turn into a deadly trap. Newspapers of the time called him the tourist hunter, an almost poetic name, if not for the terror he carried. He chose victims from far away, foreigners with no local ties, people no one would immediately notice, young backpackers, honeymooners, lone adventurers. They all disappeared in remote regions, and every time the police found a body, there was always the same trace: a stained passport, a new phrase, a personal warning. Some messages seemed like pleas for forgiveness. Others seemed like threats. One of them said, "You shouldn't trust anyone who smiles too much." Another, even more enigmatic, "He's with me now, and he's never coming back." Every word written seemed chosen to provoke fear, but also curiosity. Who was this person? A clever sadist, a former police officer, an ordinary man who discovered pleasure in manipulating other people's panic. As the city tried to forget, the mystery grew. The victims' families began to band together, exchanging information, searching for patterns that even the police themselves ignored. And that's when they noticed something frightening. All the messages used the same type of pen, the same firm, slanted stroke, as if the author wanted to be recognized. It was his signature. Have you ever been on a trip where you felt watched? Ever felt like someone knew exactly where you were, even without knowing you? Imagine that in an unfamiliar country, where you don't speak the language, where the police don't seem to listen, and where danger writes messages inside your own passport. With each new tourist who disappeared, the local media tried to silence the panic. They said it was a coincidence, that there wasn't enough evidence, but the messages kept surfacing. Some were found days later, hidden in abandoned hostels, in victims' suitcases, or delivered anonymously to police stations. The most disturbing thing is that no one ever saw the killer in action. No witnesses, no cameras, no digital trail, just the messages. And perhaps that's why, to this day, many believe he's still out there, perhaps watching unsuspecting travelers, perhaps keeping memories of every face he encountered before disappearing. This isn't just a crime. It's a story about control, about power, and about the most primal fear of all, being alone in a strange place, being watched by someone who has already decided your fate. But what no one imagined was that one of these messages, the last, would contain a clue capable of changing everything, a clue that wasn't written to scare, but to reveal. And that's where this story begins to take an even darker turn. Have you ever wondered what really happens when someone disappears in a place where no one knows them? Imagine arriving in a small tourist town, one of those that seems frozen in time: cobblestone streets, family-run inns, a central square with a clock that never tells the right time. A peaceful, isolated destination, perfect for those looking to disconnect from the world. But behind the postcard-perfect landscape, something moved silently, something that calmly chose its victims, observing each new visitor who arrived full of plans and dreams. It was the early 1990s, and the city of San Roque del Valle, hidden among mountains and surrounded by dense forests, was a spot known only to backpackers and adventurers. Everyone came for the crystal-clear waterfalls, the ancient trails, and the promise of an authentic experience, far from mass tourism. But this piece of paradise held a secret. With each new season, a tourist disappeared without a trace. First, a German student, then a Canadian couple, then an Italian photographer. And so, one by one, the names began to pile up in gap-filled police reports. The official explanation was always the same: mountain accidents, wild animal attacks, impulsive escapes. But something didn't add up. The suitcases were found intact, the passports inside, and some of these documents contained something else. A handwritten note in small, firm letters, short messages always different but with the same disturbing tone. You should have stayed home, or curiosity is the first step to hell. Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you and perhaps make you think twice about traveling to a place that's too isolated. The townspeople preferred not to comment. They said the missing people had gotten lost on their own, that it was dangerous to explore the forest without a guide. But as rumors grew, so did fear. Inns began losing guests, and many tour guides simply disappeared. One guide, who had worked in the region for over 10 years, left behind only a broken radio and a phrase scrawled on the wall of his cabin: "He talks to me." The local police, unprepared and under pressure, tried to silence the story. But then came the incident that would change everything. The body of a French tourist was found near the gorge, and inside his passport was a new message. The ink was still fresh. The B handwriting was the same, and it was at that moment that the press began calling the person responsible the passport killer. With each new disappearance, he left a mark. He took no money or valuables, just their identities, as if he wanted to erase the past of those who died, replacing it with his own words. And the strangest thing, some of the messages seemed directed at the police, almost like taunts. "You're looking in the wrong place," or "There's no point looking for me. I've already been ahead of you." Have you ever had that feeling of being watched, even when you can't see anyone around? Some tourists reported feeling this constantly in San Roque del Valle. Footsteps in the forest, cameras disappearing, and low voices in the night coming from trails that didn't exist on the maps. Over time, the town gained a dark reputation. What was once a paradise-like retreat became a place shrouded in fear and mystery. And yet, new visitors continued to arrive, curious to see the place, where a killer seemed to play tricks on the police and leave messages inside his victims' passports. What no one imagined was that behind the mountains and the stories told in hushed tones in taverns, there existed a pattern, a cycle, and it was about to repeat itself. Have you ever wondered if danger could leave clues, not to save, but to provoke? In that case, the clues were wrapped in a traveler's most intimate paper, the passports. Each document found bore a different handwritten line, a short message that seemed more like an invitation to dread than an explanation. "You should have left. You'll be next." Messages that not only announced death, but displayed a pattern, the signature of someone who had turned murder into a game of psychological control. At first, authorities treated each disappearance as isolated, a misplacement, a fatality on a treacherous trail, or a tourist who decided to take an erratic route. But attentive researchers began to notice coincidences impossible to ignore. Torn passports, removed stamps, short sentences in firm handwriting, always distinct but bearing the same trait, deliberate precision. He wasn't a criminal who acted impulsively. He was someone who studied, planned, and chose his victims carefully. The method of operation. He had a cold logic. He didn't attack on the streets during the day. He preferred the shadows of isolated hostels, the shortcuts of uncrowded trails, the itineraries suggested by an overly friendly guide. There were reports of backpackers receiving directions to better routes, and of couples accepting rides from a man with an easy smile, phony guides who disappeared into the foliage as soon as night fell. In many cases, The approach began with something banal: advice, help with the bags, a recommendation for a hostel, and ended with the person's disappearance, leaving only a passport with a cryptic phrase for whoever was left to seek answers. Stay with me until the end, because understanding this pattern is understanding the mind of someone who turned other people's curiosity into a trap. The killer's signature was, paradoxically, what put him most at risk. When he wrote, he demanded to be read. It was as if he wanted to confuse the investigation, toy with the police, and provoke the press. Instead of disappearing, he left a deliberate trail, a mark that ensured the stories would not be forgotten. And, at the same time, each message seemed calibrated to fuel collective fear. Phrases that stirred pride, naivete, and guilt, attributes many victims carried with them when they left their homes for the unknown. The researchers began mapping the sentences, comparing handwriting strokes, and looking for patterns in the locations where the passports were found. It wasn't just the content of the words, it was the circumstances. Documents were found hidden in hostel libraries, rolled up among clothes in a hostel laundry room, shoved under pillows. In one case, the passport appeared inside a locked cabinet in reception as a direct provocation to the local authorities. In another, it was left in plain sight on a bar counter, with the still half-empty drink next to it, suggesting the victim had been detained there, under eyes that pretended not to see. Have you ever felt like someone was manipulating an entire situation just to see your reaction? That's what happened. Ambushes designed to prey on normality, a recommended trail, a handed-out map, a smile that stretched too far. And when the victim disappeared, the killer returned something more than evidence, a message to the world, as if making a point of explaining, in just a few words, the purpose of the game. As police struggled to decipher the logic, the city descended into a contained panic. Guests began leaving in groups, honest guides canceled tours, and the city's reputation for tourism faltered. But the author of the messages seemed to thrive on this climate. The more attention he received, the more elaborate his subsequent sentences became. The messages made it clear that the motivation wasn't simple hatred or financial gain. It was a desire for absolute control, to dictate who had the right to be there. And it is precisely this triad, meticulous ambushes, hostels as settings, and messages as signatures, that reveals the most disturbing aspect of the case. Now let's delve into the evidence, the errors the investigation made, and the clue that may have been the first slip-up of the man behind the words. Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt as if the eyes of the person in it were still watching you? That's how many describe the feeling of seeing the images of the victims of this case. Young faces, genuine smiles, people who seem to carry the radiance of those traveling the world to discover themselves. But each of these photos today represents a destiny interrupted and a passport stained with a sentence no one should ever read. Everyone came seeking adventure. Most were backpackers, students, and couples who dreamed of exploring the country's interior, recording their experiences, learning about cultures, and collecting memories. They were tourists from different countries, united by the same desire for freedom. Among them was Elena, a 24-year-old Spanish woman traveling alone for the first time. She often wrote in her diary that she felt at home among strangers and that each city was a new chance to start over. The last time she was seen was in a cafe near the bus terminal, talking to a man who introduced himself as a local guide. 2 weeks later, her backpack was found in an abandoned inn. Inside, her passport, and a message written in small letters: "You should have left." Another name was David, an Australian photographer who crisscrossed Latin America in search of candid portraits. People remember him for his friendliness and the camera hanging around his neck. He disappeared after telling friends he had found the perfect place to photograph the sunset. When his body was discovered months later, His passport was there, folded inside his jacket, with the inscription, "Curiosity kills more than fear." And there was also Lena and Mark, a young German couple celebrating their first wedding anniversary. They sent a final letter to their family, telling them how enchanted they were by the mountains, the people, the climate. After that, silence. No sign, no response. Only a newspaper report weeks later, reporting that their passports had been found together on a stone table at the side of a trail. On the centerfold of each, the same handwriting, the same ink, the same provocation. "You shouldn't have come together. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you and perhaps disturb you a little." These aren't just names lost in police files. They're real people with stories, dreams, voices that were erased in a foreign land where no one knew how to call them by name. At the time, newspapers tried to contain the fear. The stories were short, almost cold, and local police preferred to blame chance, the weather, or the travelers' recklessness. But the public began to realize something was wrong. The coincidences were too many. The phrases seemed like conversations, messages left not only for the victims, but for anyone who dared to investigate. And what had previously been a series of isolated disappearances began to become a pattern. Residents became wary of tourism. Honest guides closed. Their businesses and foreigners arriving in the city were met with suspicious looks. Some said the killer chose victims who resembled someone from the past. Others believed he traveled between cities, following tourist trails to choose new targets. But one thing was certain. He knew who his victims were. He studied their habits, their fates, and seemed to leave different messages for each one, almost as if he were speaking to them through their passports. Messages that, together, formed a dark sequence, a kind of interrupted dialogue between life and death. And it was from these messages that the police finally began to piece together the puzzle. But what they discovered in the following passports was even more disturbing and would completely change the course of the investigation. Have you ever thought about how a small mistake can reveal a killer's best-kept secret? Sometimes, all it takes is a single detail, a mark, an oversight, a trace left where it shouldn't be, to shatter an entire illusion. That's exactly what happened in this case. After years of fear, frustrated investigations, and bodies found with stained passports and handwritten messages, something finally broke the pattern. And that something came from where no one expected. A nearly invisible fingerprint. The passport was found in an unlikely location, miles from where the victim had disappeared. It was carefully folded, protected by plastic, as if the killer wanted to ensure it would survive the test of time. Inside was a new sentence, shorter than the previous ones, you heard me. The ink looked fresh, and around the letters, a faint mark, almost imperceptible, indicated the touch of a finger. It was the first mistake, the first physical indication that the killer, until then seen as a ghost, was flesh and blood. The forensic team worked in silence for weeks, and the results were shocking. The partial fingerprints matched those of a man who had been questioned years earlier, but released due to lack of evidence. He was a former tour guide, fluent in 4 languages, known for his friendliness and charisma. He was the kind of person tourists immediately trusted. He offered help, recommended accommodations, and suggested off-the-beaten-path excursions. The kind of man who knew exactly where cameras couldn't reach, which trails were most isolated, and, most disturbingly, which foreigners spoke little of the local language. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you or leave you suspicious of every smile you receive on a trip. The investigation gained new momentum. They sifted through old files, cross-referenced dates, and compared testimonies. And the more they dug, the more evident it became that this man had been in several places at the same time. The victims disappeared. There were records of him in guest houses, in tourist photos, even in travel diaries of surviving backpackers. Some reported that he always seemed to appear when something went wrong. a lost suitcase, a confusing map, a cancelled bus. He was a convenient presence in a moment of vulnerability. Investigators began retracing the victims' paths and found eerie patterns. The same soft accent, the same kindness disguised as empathy, the same invitation for an exclusive outing. One of the survivors described a feeling he could never explain. It was as if he was studying me while smiling. And that phrase resonated with the agents on the case because that's exactly what he did. The psychological profile outlined by the experts was clear, manipulative, intelligent, patient. He didn't kill on impulse, nor out of hatred. He killed for control. Each death was a ritual of domination, each message in the passports, a way to prolong fear. He wanted them to know. He wanted the world to see his work, but without ever fully understanding why. When investigators finally pieced together all the evidence, they realized something even more macabre. All the victims had one thing in common. They were lonely foreigners with limited fluency in the language and no close family in the region. They were, quite literally, the perfect prey. And when the police understood this, they also understood what they were truly hunting: human vulnerability. Have you ever trusted someone just because they seemed kind? Have you ever taken a stranger's advice without thinking twice? Maybe that's why this case still sends chills down your spine. Because the monster everyone was looking for wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was in plain sight, walking among tourists, offering help, smiling. And it was precisely that smile, captured in an old photograph, that would lead investigators to the final mistake, the one that would reveal not only who he was, but what truly motivated him. Have you ever wondered what happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? When the one who controlled every detail, every clue, every fear, makes the mistake of letting the world realize he was still there? That's what happened when the police finally raided the mountain cabin. The rotting wood creaked under the weight of the officers' footsteps, and the silence was so thick it felt like watching back. Inside, dozens of passports were scattered across the floor, some open, others stacked like part of a collection, and among them, a message written in dark ink. "You came after me. Now I'm the one watching." No one was breathing. It was as if the killer had planned that. Moment 2. No bodies, no signs of escape, just traces, memories, and the feeling that everything there had been staged like a theatrical scene. Investigators tried to track footprints, marks, anything that might indicate where he had gone. But what they found was stranger than any hypothesis. The cabin appeared to have been abandoned for weeks, maybe months, and yet the candles were newly lit. Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you, and perhaps completely change the way you view this case. Versions began to multiply. The first claimed he fled that very night, that he knew the trails better than any guide in the region and used the terrain to his advantage. The second claimed he never actually escaped, that someone helped him disappear, perhaps a police conspiracy, perhaps a pact with powerful individuals interested in keeping certain truths buried. The third was even more disturbing. It claimed he never existed, that the messages were written by more than one person, by impersonators obsessed with continuing the ritual. Official investigations dragged on for months, but the truth is that no one could explain how the messages kept appearing. Even after the cabin was discovered, new passports began to surface, left at bus stations, hostels, and even inside the backpacks of travelers who claimed they'd never lost anything. It was as if the killer was still active, or someone was continuing what he started. Have you ever felt the strange sensation of being watched even when you're alone? Some tourists who visited the city after the incident reported exactly that. Distant voices in the night, light footsteps behind doors, and, most unsettling, notes left in their rooms. Short, direct, like a whisper on paper. "I know who you are." The police tried to explain it rationally, but the more they tried, the more inexplicable the evidence became. The killer's psychological profile indicated a man obsessed with control, but the new Messages seemed to be written by different people. Some experts even suggested that the case had become a kind of collective ritual, a cult of the tourist hunter. Fear had become contagious, and terror a legacy. The strangest thing, however, happened years later. One of the original researchers received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single page, torn from an old passport, and a sentence written in the same handwriting he knew well. "You looked for me. Now it's my turn." No one ever figured out where that letter came from. No DNA, no fingerprints, no concrete clues. But one thing seemed clear. Whoever it was, he or they were still around. And it is precisely at this point that the mystery turns into something even darker. Because what came after this letter showed that the case was far from over. Have you ever trusted someone you just met? Maybe a friendly driver, a smiling tour guide, or a stranger who helped you find your way around an unfamiliar city. The truth is we do it all the time, and we rarely stop to consider who's really behind that friendly look. But what if, behind that smile, there was something much darker? What if danger wasn't in the shadows, but sitting right next to you, offering help? The case of the passport killer forces us to face this question head-on. For years, he circulated freely among tourists, exploiting the trust of those who believed they were simply having an adventure. His victims came from different places, spoke different languages, but they all had one thing in common. They believed in human kindness, and perhaps that's what makes this story so disturbing, because deep down, we could all have been one of those people. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you, and perhaps make you rethink the way you look at the world. When we travel, we lower our defenses. We push instinct aside and make room for wonder. We trust drivers, hosts, strangers who point out shortcuts and inns. It's an involuntary, almost poetic act of faith. But for someone like him, this faith was a weakness to be exploited. He studied tourists like a hunter watches his prey, waiting for the moment when trust turned into vulnerability. Perhaps the true terror of this story lies not in the crimes themselves, but in the mirror it holds before our eyes. Because the killer didn't hide in dark alleys or among the trees of the forest. He was in plain sight, mingling with the crowd, smiling, offering help. He shows us that evil doesn't need grotesque masks or screams to exist. Sometimes he speaks softly, wears clean clothes, and extends his hand. Have you ever been there? That moment when something felt wrong, but you chose to ignore your instincts. That slight shiver, that intuition that made you hesitate, and yet you kept going. That's where the danger lies. It's in that second of trust that monsters breathe easy. Investigators working on the case said the most frightening thing wasn't the number of victims, but how normal everything seemed. The inns were common, the paths were the same ones taken by thousands of tourists. There were no screams, no cinematic chases. Just silent disappearances and calmly written messages. It was evil acting patiently, watching, waiting, and that's why, even so many years later, this story still haunts, because it speaks about something that goes far beyond a murderer. It speaks about us, about the trust we give without thinking, about the times we believe this would never happen to me. But the truth is, no one is truly prepared for the unexpected. Perhaps the real terror lies not in the killer, but in what he shows us. How much we trust strangers when we're far from home. How fragile we are in the face of kindness, and how much we want to believe the world is a safe place. But what if it isn't? If this story gave you goosebumps, leave a like and comment on which country you're watching from. I want to know, if you were a tourist in that city, would you have noticed the signs? And before you leave, remember one thing. Sometimes danger doesn't come with screams or footsteps behind you. Sometimes it comes with a smile, and it's closer than you think. And perhaps that's precisely what's most frightening, realizing that trust, that invisible thread that connects strangers, can be the thread that leads us straight to danger. Yet, it's what allows us to live, travel, and experience new things. Duality is inevitable. Without trust, there's no connection. But sometimes it's precisely trust that brings us face to face with the abyss. If this topic makes sense to you, if at any point in this story you found yourself reflecting on something you've already experienced, leave here in the comments what touched you the most. Maybe you've felt that shiver of distrust on a trip, or perhaps you've trusted someone too much when they didn't deserve it. Sharing these experiences isn't just a way to vent, it's a way to transform fear into learning, to help others see signs that often go unnoticed. And of course, if you're feeling the same tension I felt telling this story, like the video, this simple gesture shows that this type of content touches you, that it's worth continuing to bring these real, intense and mysterious narratives. Every like helps this channel reach more people who, like you, love immersing themselves in stories that blend suspense, emotion, and the dark side of human nature. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow. When you comment, like, or subscribe, you're not just supporting the work, you're helping to keep alive a community of curious people who seek to understand what lies behind real crimes, legends, and mysteries. This space is ours, and it's your voice in the comments that makes it more human, more profound, and in some way safer to continue exploring these truths that so many avoid facing head-on. Then, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because each new story is a new dive into the unknown, and you won't want to miss what comes next. What we're building here goes far beyond videos. It's an exchange, a conversation about what scares us, but also about what connects us. And speaking of connection, there's something else you might need to hear. Something that could completely change the way you understand everything that's happened so far. The police officer took a deep breath before opening the passport. The leather cover was damp, stained with something that time could no longer completely erase. The pages trembled between his fingers, and the dry sound of the paper being turned echoed through the empty room. On the third page, right in the center, he found the sentence, written in tiny, almost careful letters, as if the author took pleasure in every stroke. I told you not to come here. No signature, no obvious clues, just the suffocating weight of a warning that seemed to have reached beyond time. Have you ever felt your heart race without knowing exactly why? As if something inside you recognized danger before your mind even grasped it? That's how that police officer described the moment. A shiver that ran up your spine and made everything around you colder, denser. The breeze coming through the window seemed to carry voices, and outside, the sound of the wind whipping against the trees mingled with the distant echo of footsteps no one could locate. Previous investigations into the disappearance of tourists in that city had been inconclusive. Each case seemed isolated, a drowning, an escape, a loss of documents. But that passport would change everything, not just because of the wording, but because of the handwriting. There was something in the way the letters slanted, as if dancing between sarcasm and contempt. The author didn't want to hide. He wanted to be read. He wanted to be understood and feared. This town was small, surrounded by mountains with narrow streets and old houses. At night, fog enveloped everything, and the streetlights created shadows that moved on their own. For the locals, the disappearances were just another story among many. Tourists always disappear, they said. Sometimes they get lost. Sometimes they don't want to be found. But something was different that year. The number of cases increased, and the coincidences began to pile up. Passports found in unlikely places, short sentences written with the same precision, always accompanied by an almost ritualistic feeling. Have you ever noticed how certain places seem to hold memories, even when no one else remembers them? As if the walls, the trees, and the air knew what happened there, just waiting for someone curious enough to find out? This city had that kind of energy, a mix of melancholy and danger. And for those who arrived without knowledge of the history, it felt welcoming, until the moment the silence became too loud. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what this case reveals goes far beyond a simple murder. It talks about decisions, the ones we make every day without realizing how much they can change everything. The decision to trust, to follow a path, to accept help. Small gestures that seem innocent, but that sometimes define the line between returning home and disappearing forever. Each tourist who arrived brought with them a different story, but they all shared the same mistake. They believed they were safe. The city seemed peaceful. The residents were kind, and the danger was invisible. But behind the tranquil routine there was a hidden truth, something that hid in the cracks of everyday life. A man, or perhaps more than one, who observed, studied, and chose. The pattern only began to emerge when investigators realized that all the victims had been seen talking to someone who seemed to be helping. A fake guide, a driver, a guest house host, the perfect predator because he was playing the friend. As clues piled up, the city plunged into silent panic. Newspapers struggled to publish. Police tried to hide the details to avoid chaos, and residents began to create their own versions. Some said it was a ritual, others that it was revenge. Someone who had lost everything and was now preying on tourists to compensate for the pain. None of these theories explained the messages. They kept appearing, always inside passports, as if the killer wanted to turn fear into memory. There's something deeply human about this story, and perhaps that's what makes it so disturbing, because deep down, we all search control. We want to be remembered. We want to leave our mark. We want the world to know we exist. And this man did just that, but in the darkest way possible. He turned life and death into a macabre art. The most intriguing thing is that even with so much evidence, no one knew his real name. There were false records, mistaken identities, and conflicting reports about his appearance. To some, he was a young, polite man with a difficult-to-identify accent. To others, he was older, with a cold, distant look in his eyes. And perhaps this was the greatest trick of all. He became what each victim needed to see, the perfect reflection of trust. People who survived encounters with him described a strange sensation, that of being watched even after the conversation ended. Some claimed to have received anonymous notes days later, with enigmatic phrases, always short, always threatening. Others said they heard their own voice, being imitated on the phone. Coincidence, perhaps. But those who experienced it never forgot it, and the scariest thing is that, as the years passed, the case continued to multiply in rumors. Online groups began sharing images, supposed new messages, and theories about the killer's whereabouts. Some believe he's dead. Others believe he still travels the world, changing his name and leaving his messages where no one would think to look. This story isn't just about a crime. It's about fragility of perception, about how fear can shape reality, and about how the simplest choices, like accepting help from a stranger, can open doors that should never be opened. What if all this was a warning, a lesson disguised as terror? Perhaps the messages left in the passports weren't just provocations, but attempts to communicate something no one understood in time. Perhaps the real mystery lies in what wasn't said, in the subtext that investigators overlooked. After all, how many secrets does the world hide behind kind faces and easy smiles? How many truths remain locked away, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to try to uncover them? Comment here. That makes sense to me. Have you ever felt like a place was watching you? Not a person. A place as if every wall, every tree, every stone knew more about you than it should. That's how it was in San Roque del Valle, a small tourist town lost among the mountains of the interior, surrounded by dense forests and a fog that never seemed to completely dissipate. A spot on the map that seemed tailor-made for mystery. In the 1990s, it was the perfect refuge for those seeking peace, trails, and hidden waterfalls, but also, unbeknownst to them, the ideal setting for silent terror. The streets were narrow and cobblestone, the air always smelled of burning wood and strong coffee, and the residents lived with the kind of calm that only small towns can maintain. At first glance, San Roque seemed like a place where nothing bad could happen. And perhaps that's why tourists let their guard down so much. People from all over the world arrived with backpacks on their backs and cameras slung around their necks, seeking adventure, connection with nature, or simply a break from the hustle and bustle. But little by little, this town began to develop a reputation no one wanted, that of swallowing people. It all started with an isolated disappearance, a German backpacker who never returned from a hike. Then, a Canadian couple who left their hotel room tidy, their bags packed, and disappeared without taking anything. The police said they were accidents, that the region was treacherous, and that the forest could deceive even the most experienced. But something didn't make sense. The bags were always found intact, the wallets full of cash, and in some cases the passports left on the beds, as if they had been placed there on purpose. At first, no one wanted to believe there was a pattern. Authorities insisted on the idea of coincidence, and local newspapers published small, discreet articles, trying not to tarnish the city's image. But the number of disappearances grew. With each new season, a new tourist disappeared. Some residents began to notice strange details, figures on the roads at night, lights moving in the forest, noises that sounded like whispers carried by the wind. And then came the first case that changed everything, the stained passport. He was found in a remote inn, inside a room that should have been empty. The cleaning lady claimed to have heard footsteps during the night, but when she opened the door in the morning, there was only silence. On the pillow was an open passport, and a sentence written on the identification page. "I told you not to come here." No one could say whose handwriting it was, and fingerprints had been carefully erased. This detail, the handwritten phrase, turned fear into hysteria. The news spread among tourists, and the city, once known for its trails and waterfalls, became remembered for its disappearances and messages. Still, people kept coming, perhaps driven by curiosity, perhaps by disbelief that something like this could be real. But evil didn't need everyone to believe in it to act. All it took was an opportunity. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this case isn't just about disappearances, it's about perception, about how human beings insist on ignoring signs when what's at stake is their own curiosity. There's a fine line between seeking transformative experiences and defying one's own survival instinct. And in that city, that line was crossed every day. Those arriving in San Roque were enchanted by the landscape, but there was something subtle, almost imperceptible, that changed the atmosphere. A slight chill that came not from the weather, but from discomfort. Some tourists said they felt as if they were being watched on the trails. Others swore they heard the sound of footsteps following them in the distance. But nothing concrete enough to seem dangerous. And that was precisely what made it all so effective. With each new disappearance, the town was divided between fear and denial. On one side, terrified residents locked their doors, avoiding going out at night, and on the other, merchants who depended on tourism trying to keep up appearances. For many, the danger was just a legend, an exaggeration, a rumor fueled by outsiders, but those who lived there knew something lurked in those mountains. Investigators began arriving from other regions, and the more they dug, the more confused they became. The stories didn't add up. Witnesses changed their versions, records disappeared, and the climate of suspicion grew. No one knew if the culprit was a local, an outsider, or if more than one person was involved. What they did know was that the messages left in the passports weren't mere coincidence. They were messages, calls, warnings from someone who wanted to be noticed, but at the same time remained invisible. And it's strange to think that even in the face of so much fear, people still sought out the city. It's as if there were a kind of perverse magnetism there, something that mixed curiosity with fascination. Perhaps because human beings have this tendency to approach danger when it seems shrouded in mystery, as if the unknown were a mirror, reflecting not what we fear, but what we hide. Some say San Roque del Valle was cursed, that something happened long before the 1990s, and that the disappearances were merely the echo of a past no one dared speak of. Others believe that the killer, if there was only one, used the town as a trap, a stage where the terror could repeat itself indefinitely, leaving no trace. The most disturbing thing is realizing that even after so much time, travelers still disappear in that region. Some leave only photos, others incomplete messages. But history always repeats itself, and every time someone tries to explain, the fog seems to swallow a new name. Comment here. I'm on that journey too. The first time anyone noticed the pattern was by chance. A local police officer, tired of hearing the same excuses about distracted tourists and trail accidents, noticed something in the passports being collected. They were different from different countries, but there was one detail no one had connected yet. Small tears along the edges, always on the same page. Sometimes a subtle cut, other times a fold that seemed intentional. And on 3 of them, there were words handwritten in the same font. It was a firm, almost elegant script, as if the author took pleasure in every curve of the letters. The messages varied. You should have left. You'll be next. Curiosity is what kills first. But the tone was always the same. Provocation. A warning that sounded more like a promise. That's when they realized the disappearances weren't coincidences. They were carefully orchestrated. The victims were chosen, followed, and observed. Each one passed through the same places, slept in the same inns, and at some point encountered the same person, a man offering help. Sometimes he introduced himself as a tour guide, other times as a hostel employee, a driver, or even another friendly traveler who knew the best routes in the area. No one suspected anything because he seemed normal, and that was the trick. Have you ever met someone like this? Someone who seems to have answers for everything, who speaks calmly, who inspires immediate and confidence. It's this kind of person that instincts often ignore, because true evil doesn't need to shout. It whispers, it smiles, and it's precisely this stillness that makes it so dangerous. Investigators began piecing together the pieces with surgical patience. The inns were inspected, guests' names reviewed, guides questioned. Nothing. No sign of anyone suspicious, but one coincidence caught their attention. All the victims had left positive reviews about the same place, a small hostel at the top of a winding road known as La Cumbre, a secluded spot surrounded by forest overlooking the valley, the kind of place any tourist would find enchanting. When the agents arrived, they found the building empty. There were no guests, no staff, only silence. The smell of mold and damp earth permeated the air. The rooms had perfectly made beds and walls marked with small scratches, as if someone had tried to write something with their fingernails. And on the reception desk, 3 passports sat, side by side, as if waiting to be collected. Inside each one, a new message. The letters were the same, and the sentences increasingly direct. You don't learn. From that point on, investigators understood they weren't just after a killer, but someone obsessed with control. He didn't kill out of rage. He killed to dominate. He wanted to dictate the pace of fear, to be the author of the story, and the messages were his signature. Each sentence seemed carefully planned, not to hide the crime, but to make it unforgettable. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because this obsession with control reveals something more than psychopathy. It shows a mentality, a twisted logic, built on the pleasure of manipulation and observation. He saw his victims as pieces in a game, and the world around him as a board he could rearrange at will. Each trap was a staging, a silent performance that transformed horror into art. The most impressive thing is how unhurried everything was. The ambushes occurred in moments of vulnerability, a deserted road, a narrow trail, a bar where everyone seemed friendly. The killer chose the moment when trust peaked, and then he struck. Police believe he spent days studying his victims, observing their habits, listening in on conversations, following them from a distance. He knew when they were tired, when they felt safe, when they were letting their guard down. And that's when he stepped in, always with a kind gesture, offering a ride, showing a shortcut, helping carry their bags. The victims never saw the danger. There was no fight, no fuss. He acted as if he were leading a dance, a calculated step, a subtle approach, and the disappearance happened without a sound. Then came the part that satisfied him most, the ritual. He left his passport as a witness and wrote the message with a coolness that bordered on the artistic. Some criminologists called it homicidal narcissism, others a symbolic expression of power. But for those who witnessed it firsthand, it was more than that. It was a need to exist through fear. Have you ever thought about this, about how fear can be a form of immortality? He knew that by leaving traces he would never be forgotten, and perhaps that was exactly what he sought, to be remembered, to be the subject of conversations, theories, nightmares, to become a shadow that no one could erase. The difference is that, in his game, the pieces couldn't start over. Newspapers began covering the case with sensational headlines, and residents began seeing figures everywhere. Any lone man became a suspect, and the La Cumbre shelter was closed off, but never demolished. It's said that even today, people hear footsteps there, and that sometimes a window opens by itself, letting out the sound of pages turning. The police, however, were far from closing the case. They had more questions than answers. The messages kept appearing in new places, in different languages, as if the killer wanted to prove he was still in control, or perhaps just toying with those trying to hunt him down. And most disturbing of all, some investigators believed he never acted alone, that the different phrases, though similar, hid subtle variations in style, as if multiple hands were behind the same pattern. Copycats, accomplices, or simply curious onlookers trying to keep the terror alive. No one knows for sure, but what we do know is that, in that city, trust became a luxury. People began locking their doors even during the day, looking over their shoulders and distrusting kind smiles. And that's where the killer won, not just through the lives he took, but through the fear he left behind. He turned distrust into routine, doubt into a legacy. The case became a legend. New generations grew up hearing about the marked passports, the handwritten phrases. Some doubt it, others say they know someone who knew someone who saw it. Time has transformed the story into myth, but the psychological trace remains. Because true horror is never just the crimes themselves, it's what they awaken within us. Comment here, that makes sense to me. Elena was from Spain. She was 24 years old and traveling alone for the first time. She was the kind of person who believed the world was essentially good, that all it took was a smile and a kind word for any stranger to become a friend. She wrote every day in a red-covered notebook, describing the places she visited, the people she met, the smell of the roads, and the taste of the local coffees. I want to experience the world before choosing where I want to stay, she wrote on the last page found. The notebook was found along with her backpack, dropped near the San Roque del Valle bus station. Inside was her passport and a sentence written in dark ink: "You should have left." People who knew her remember her infectious enthusiasm. Elena believed in new beginnings, and perhaps that's why she ignored the small signs. The man who helped her carry her bags to the hostel, the same one who insisted on showing her a trail almost no one knew, was described as kind, helpful, and fluent in several languages. No one saw him after that day. David was Australian. He was 32 years old and a nature photographer. He traveled alone, sleeping in hostels and campsites, searching for landscapes that felt alive. He was passionate about portraying people, capturing real expressions. A person's face always counts more than the landscape behind them, he would say in his letters. The last photo he took showed the entrance to a dirt road, surrounded by trees that formed a natural tunnel. On the back of the image, just a note. He said the sunset here is unforgettable. Fellow travelers said David mentioned a local guide who would be accompanying him that day. Someone who seemed to know the forest like no one else. No one saw him again. 3 months later, his body was found near a stream, with his passport tucked inside his coat. The message this time read, "Curiosity kills more than fear." And then there were Lena and Mark, the German couple celebrating their first wedding anniversary. Young, adventurous, full of plans. They had decided to travel across Latin America by bus, capturing everything on video to turn their journey into a documentary. In their last video, they appear smiling, walking along a sunny trail, laughing at something only they understood. That night, they sent a message to their family. "This place is beautiful. The people are kind. It feels like a dream." After that silence, authorities found the shack intact, the cameras, the money, the clothes folded. Only the passports had been moved. They lay on a rock side by side, with the same handwriting on each. "You shouldn't have come together." These stories began to spread like wildfire. Newspapers tried to contain the panic, describing the cases as tragic coincidences. "Unwary tourists ignore security warnings," the headlines read. But the townspeople knew it was no coincidence. The victims' names became whispers, and each new disappearance heightened the tension. Entire families began locking their windows even during the day, and innkeepers began placing crosses on their doors, as if to ward off something invisible. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because behind each of these victims there is something that goes beyond pain and fear. There is a mirror of our own mentality faced with the unknown. Most of them ignored the danger not out of carelessness but out of hope. They wanted to believe the world was still a safe place, that goodness could overcome risk. And perhaps that's what's most disturbing in this case, realizing that evil doesn't need to scream to be heard. It just waits for naivety to pave the way. Each face forgotten in the photos is a cruel reminder of how the search for freedom can be mistaken for vulnerability. Elena, David, Lena, and Mark weren't running from life. They were trying to find it. And that's precisely what the killer understood. He didn't hunt bodies, he hunted the purity of intentions. He transformed dreams into warning messages. His phrases, written inside the passports, weren't just provocations. They were silent epitaphs for a generation that believed in the beauty of the unpredictable. Over time, the fear stopped being limited to tourists. Locals themselves began disappearing. Men who worked as guides, innkeepers, truck drivers who passed through the region's roads. The difference is that in these cases there were no messages, no warning, as if the killer was saving his words for the main spectacle. Under pressure, authorities tried at all costs to control the narrative. The city depended on tourism, and admitting the existence of a serial killer meant economic ruin. Thus, silence became political. Reports were censored, investigators removed, and the families of foreign victims received compensation to close the matter. But nothing could erase the echo of the messages. Fear, when it cannot be named, grows. People began to create their own explanations. They spoke of rituals, ancient curses, ghosts of the mountains. Some believed the killer wasn't human, but rather something that had inhabited that place for a long time. But the most attentive researchers knew the truth was less mystical and more perverse, because the pattern of deaths revealed a logical, cold, and patient mind. Each message seemed written with the purpose of shaping the reader's behavior. It was as if the author wanted the terror to spread on its own. For fear to do the work, he no longer needed to do with his own hands. A psychological manipulation so effective that it transformed the entire city into an extension of his mind. Meanwhile, the victims' portraits began to appear on makeshift murals in the squares. Faded photos, dried flowers, burned-out candles. It was impossible not to feel the weight of each gaze frozen in time. Gazes that seemed to beg for something, perhaps justice, perhaps remembrance. But no one had any answers. With each new attempt at investigation, the case became more nebulous. It was as if the clues were erasing themselves, as if time itself were conspiring to protect the killer. And yet, there was something common in all the stories, the presence of someone kind, a face that went unnoticed, a calm voice offering help, a coincidence that by now no longer seemed like a coincidence. It's frightening to realize how easily humanity can be manipulated by the appearance of kindness, how much we trust without measuring the cost. The victims of San Roque del Valle weren't killed by just one man. They were victims of trust itself, of their own desire to believe that the world is still a safe place. And it's precisely this contrast between the beauty of hope and the abyss of horror that makes this case so unforgettable. Because in the end, everyone came looking for adventure and ended up leaving behind only a photograph and a stained passport. Comment here. That makes sense to me. The mistake came like a crack in a seemingly unbreakable pane of glass. For years, the case was sustained by mystery and silence, a calculated game where each piece was placed with almost artistic precision. But one day, something went haywire. One of the passports found wasn't at the crime scene, nor among the victim's belongings. It was discovered in a completely unlikely place, inside a donation box, in an abandoned church, miles away. Someone had left it there on purpose, almost as a provocation, only this time the handwritten message bore something never before seen, a mark, a smudge of ink mixed with the faint trace of a fingerprint. When the forensic investigation revealed the results, the impact was immediate. For the first time, the killer had a face. The fingerprints belonged to a man who had been questioned years earlier but released due to lack of evidence. The name was Rafael Dominguez, a former tour guide who worked in the very region where the first disappearances occurred. Born in Cordoba, fluent in English, French and German, he was known for his friendliness and ability to adapt to any visitor. Many tourists described him as the kind of person who made you feel safe even in the middle of the forest. When authorities revisited his past, the puzzle began to take shape. Rafael had worked in several inns before opening his own customized tour service, a service that allowed him to move freely among tourists from different countries. He knew shortcuts, secret trails, and mastered the region's geography like few others. But what stood out most was his observation skills. He knew the right language to use, the exact tone of voice to gain trust. He was a silent manipulator, the kind of person who didn't need to assert authority. He simply looked, smiled, and waited. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what this mistake revealed goes far beyond a simple slip-up. It exposed the hidden truth behind the mind of someone who turned control into art. Raphael wasn't just a killer, he was a student of human behavior. He understood decisions, of vulnerabilities, of moments when fear merges with curiosity. He observed how people moved when they were far from home, how their defenses dissolved in the face of the feeling of freedom. He hunted for the exact moment when trust overcame instinct. Investigators discovered that he kept detailed notes on the languages, customs, and gestures of different cultures. Each page was a kind of psychological map. There were records of facial expressions, body reactions, and phrases that sounded comforting to each nationality. It was as if he studied his victims before even meeting them. This strategic coldness transformed each murder into an experience of absolute mastery. He didn't just take lives, he controlled the fear of an entire community. But what really caught the forensic team's attention was another detail. On one of the pages of his old workbook, there were written sentences that looked like drafts of the messages left in passports. Some were identical, others in different versions, as if he were testing the musicality of the words. This proved that the sentences weren't written on impulse, but planned in advance. He wanted to make an impact. He wanted to provoke, but also to teach something, as if there were a twisted moral logic behind every crime. When police cross-referenced travel and accommodation records, they noticed an even more frightening pattern. Raphael was always in the area before each disappearance. He always offered help, suggested alternative routes, and introduced people. He was the invisible thread connecting all the stories, but no one ever suspected because his face was everywhere. He had become part of the scene. The turning point came when an investigator noticed something curious. Almost all the victims had one thing in common. They spoke little of the local language. They were vulnerable to dependence on their guides, and he used this as a weapon. From that point on, the profile was complete. A man with above-average intelligence, narcissistic traits, calculated behavior, and a pathological desire for control. Raphael didn't kill out of anger, nor for immediate pleasure. He killed for power. As the case gained traction in the newspapers, authorities prepared an operation to capture him. The tension was almost palpable. News spread quickly, and Raphael's name began to be repeated throughout the country. But what no one expected was that he seemed to anticipate every move the police made. When they arrived at the house where he supposedly lived, they found the place empty, too clean, too organized, as if he had left only minutes before. On the table, an envelope. Inside, an open passport and a new message. "You guys are late again." The feeling was one of helplessness. The killer seemed to play with the investigation itself, turning the hunt into a spectacle. At every step the police took, he responded with a calculated move. He seemed to understand the investigators' minds as much as he understood those of his victims. This led some experts to believe that Raphael might have had help, someone within the police force who kept him informed of the search progress. Others believed he simply observed everything from afar, blending in with the crowd searching for him. From that point on, the case stopped being just a criminal investigation and became a psychological journey. The agents began to question the extent of his control. Could he have predicted every decision with such precision? Or was collective fear causing the entire world to bend to his will? The impact was devastating. Tourists canceled trips, residents fled the city, and silence became the norm. Newspapers tried to fill the void with theories, but none seemed to capture the complexity of what was happening. It was as if Raphael himself had become a ghost, an entity hovering over the city, alive or not, but ever present. Still, there was an uneasy certainty. Somewhere he was watching, and each new clue he uncovered felt like another piece he'd placed, guiding the investigators where he wanted them to go. Raphael turned terror into a chess game, and the entire city became his board. The line between truth and fabrication began to blur. Some agents began to doubt even the evidence they found. It was as if he were manipulating even what should have been reality, and it was at this point that the investigation stopped being just about who. It became about how. How could someone control so much, even when absent? How could one man's fear transform into a force that moved hundreds of people simultaneously? The answer, perhaps, lay in the messages themselves, because, contrary to what everyone thought, those phrases weren't just threats. They were codes, clues. And when a researcher finally realized this, the game changed. But this discovery opened a door that perhaps should never have been opened. Comment here. That makes sense to me. When they finally surrounded the cabin, the air felt heavier than ever. The agents moved in silence, each step creaking on the damp floorboards, as if the floor itself resisted what was about to be discovered. It was as if time had stopped there, trapped between the smell of old wood and the feeling that something, or someone, still watched. The door was broken down, and what they found, on the other side, completely changed the course of the investigation. The place seemed like a shrine of distorted memories. Hundreds of passports were scattered across the floor, some stacked, others open, each with a different handwritten phrase. Phrases that seemed to form a kind of manifesto, a silent diary of someone who transformed fear into language. On a table, an open notebook displayed the last words that to this day remain unexplained. "You came after me. Now I'm the one watching. But Rafael Dominguez was gone. No body, no sign of a recent escape, no fresh footprints, only the trace of a presence that seemed to have dissolved into thin air. The still warm coffee on the stove indicated someone had been there minutes before the invasion. There were also clean clothes hanging and a partially burned map marking routes that cut across borders. It felt as if he had foreseen the siege and simply disappeared at just the right moment. Now, I want to go even deeper into this. Subject: because what started as a hunt for a criminal ended up revealing something much bigger. A hidden truth about power, influence, and manipulation. With Raphael's disappearance, theories emerged that divided the city and confused even the investigators themselves. Some believed he had accomplices within the police force, people who tipped him off about the operation in exchange for silence. Others swore there was something ritualistic about it all, the phrases, the precise handwriting, the repetition of the messages, as if each murder were part of a code, and the cabin the altar where he recorded his work. There were still those who advanced a more disturbing hypothesis. Raphael never acted alone. According to reports that were never made public, partial fingerprints of other people were also found on some passports. This led to the idea that the killer had created a circle of copycats, individuals fascinated by him, who continued his work after his disappearance. It was as if the terror had become contagious, spreading like a disease, and in a way this makes sense. When a story is powerful enough, it transcends reality. It ceases to be just fact and becomes myth. Raphael no longer needed to be alive to continue existing. Fear was enough. And that fear, never disappeared. The city fell into psychological collapse. Inns closed, roads were blocked, and the forest that once attracted adventurers became forbidden territory. Even so, reports of new messages continued to surface, some written on walls, others left in lost backpacks, all with the same tone, the same lines, the same intention of reminding them that the game wasn't over yet. Some believed he was still around, in disguise, blending in among the curious onlookers investigating the case. Others said he never really existed, that Rafael Dominguez was just a fabricated identity used by different people over the years to cover up various crimes. Collective farce, fueled by fear and the human need to name what is not understood. But there's one detail few know. When experts returned to the cabin weeks later, they found something that hadn't been there before. In the center of the master bedroom was a mirror, large, antique, with a dark frame, and on the glass, written in the same type of ink as the original messages, was a new sentence: "While you look at me, I see you." The forensics confirmed it. The handwriting was his. This meant that, somehow, he had returned, or someone who looked a lot like him. From that point on, the case spiraled completely out of control. No authorities wanted to get involved, and the investigation was officially closed. But for the locals, Raphael's disappearance was just the beginning of something bigger. People began reporting strange encounters, voices in the forest, figures by the roadside. Some swore they'd seen a man walking at night with a flashlight, always alone, always smiling. And the curious thing is that the new reports followed a pattern. Disappearances began to occur again, but more discreetly, almost imperceptibly. Tourists traveling alone, backpackers without documents, people no one immediately sought. The difference was that now the messages no longer appeared in passports. They came in a different form, left in mailboxes, sent by email, written on folded papers inside found suitcases. Retired investigators on the case said this could only mean one thing: someone was carrying on the legacy. And deep down, that idea was even more terrifying than the existence of a single killer. Because the terror becomes infinite when you stop depending on one person and start living inside one. Collective mentality. It's the same principle that guides certain movements, sects, or ideologies. It all starts with a mind obsessed with control, and then spreads to others seeking the same power, the feeling of being invisible, of dictating fear, of shaping reality. Raphael, or whoever it was, had understood this. True dominion wasn't over the victims, but over the narrative, over how people would remember him. And strange as it may seem, perhaps this was the plan all along. Perhaps he never wanted to just kill. Perhaps he wanted to become an eternal presence, something that seeps into stories, memories, nightmares, someone who doesn't need to exist to continue to influence. 10 years after the case ended, a new discovery reignited the terror. A group of explorers found a cabin identical to the original, nearly 40 kilometers away. Inside the same objects, old passports, maps, candles, and on the floor a tape recording. The voice was unmistakable, calm, confident, almost hypnotic. It said, "You think you're hunting me, but I'm the one guiding every step. There's no prison for those who live inside other people's minds. No one knows who made the recording." Experts tried to identify the voice, but the audio was distorted, as if it had been deliberately manipulated. The case returned to the newspapers, reigniting panic, and once again he was gone, not physically, but as an idea. Today, many believe that Rafael Dominguez never died, that he simply changed his name, his face, his country. There are reports of passports with similar phrases being found on other continents, from Argentina to Morocco, from France to Thailand. Maybe they're copycats, maybe it's him. No one knows for sure. But there's an even more disturbing theory. What if he'd never left San Roque del Valle? What if that day, when the police raided the cabin, he was already there, watching from a distance, smiling from behind the trees, pleased with the spectacle he'd created? Because, in the end, that's what this case teaches us. True power isn't in disappearing. It's in remaining, in becoming part of history, part of doubt, part of the collective imagination. And that's why, to this day, anyone who visits that city swears they feel the same chill when the wind blows through the forest, as if someone, somewhere, is still watching. Comment here, I'm on that journey too. Sometimes I wonder what truly scares people. It's not the blood nor the crime itself. It's what it reveals about us. Because when we look at the case of Rafael Dominguez, the passport killer, we realize that the terror isn't just in what he did, but in what he shows us, how much we trust, how much we let our guard down in the face of a smile, a calm voice, someone who seems to understand what we want to hear, how much, without realizing it, we hand over control of our safety to complete strangers. This is the frightening truth. Danger rarely arrives with a dangerous face. It disguises itself as kindness, as helpfulness, as empathy. Raphael understood this better than anyone. He didn't hunt in the dark. He hunted in the light of day, amidst small talk, in the comfort of trust. And that's what makes his story so disturbing. Because in a way, he simply used something we all do all the time, trusting that others won't hurt us. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what this story awakens isn't just fear, it's awareness. The line between safe and dangerous, between right and wrong, is much thinner than we imagine. With every choice, with every seemingly small decision, we create gaps, and within these gaps lie the hidden truths of humanity. Trust is the fuel of human relationships, but also the gateway through which manipulation enters. Raphael only existed because he encountered people too open, too curious, too innocent. He didn't need to force it. He simply observed, understood, and acted. And the strangest thing is that this logic doesn't just apply to him. How often in our daily lives do we also manipulate the environment around us? How often do we adjust our words, our tone of voice, our gaze, all to get what we want, even if subtly? The difference is that in some, this need for control becomes an obsession. In others, it becomes survival. It's a fine line, almost invisible, but real. Raphael, represented a kind of distorted mirror of society. He understood that true power lay not in killing, but in control the narrative, in dictating how he would be remembered, in transforming fear into legacy. When his messages began to appear in other countries, doubt became more powerful than any proof. Was it him? Were they copycats? Or was it just fear continuing the work he started? This is the most brilliant and darkest part of the human mind. When an idea is strong enough, it survives on its own. The residents of San Roque del Valle learned this the hard way. Today, few talk about the incident. Some deny it ever existed, as if ignoring it were the same as erasing it. Others still dream about it. They say they sometimes see a man on the road, standing, watching the cars pass by, with a map in his hands and a restrained smile. Maybe it's just their imagination. Maybe it's an echo. Or maybe it's him, still playing the same game, invisible but present, a reminder that fear doesn't die. It transforms. This kind of story forces us to face something uncomfortable, our own vulnerability. When we travel, when we're far from home, far from what's familiar, we're exposed, not just physically, but emotionally. We want to belong, we want to understand, we want to trust. And that's exactly where the danger lurks, in the desire to believe. Raphael used this as a weapon, and perhaps that's why it was so effective. He didn't need to chase after his victims. He just had to wait for them to come to him. But there's something even deeper to all this. With each story like this, we're reminded that evil is rarely what we imagine. It doesn't scream. It doesn't reveal itself immediately. It seeps into gestures, intentions, the subtle decisions we make without realizing it. It's the taxi driver who seems too friendly, the stranger who offers help, the gaze that lingers a second longer than it should. And it's this kind of realization that changes everything when we begin to see beyond the surface. Perhaps the true terror lies not in the killer, but in what he reveals, how much we trust strangers when we're far from home. How much we need to believe in goodness, even knowing the risk it brings. It's this contradiction that defines us, and it's also what puts us at the mercy of people like him. Rafael Dominguez didn't just take lives. He planted a doubt that will never completely disappear. What if someone smiles at you on the street tomorrow? What if that person knows your name, your language, your destination? Would you trust them? Or remember the messages left inside those passports? The answer might say more about you than it does about them. In the end, this story isn't just about crime, it's about mentality, about day, about the small choices that shape the course of our lives, and sometimes our demise. Raphael was a product of his environment, but also a reflection of something we'd rather not admit, the fact that evil can be seductive, that darkness can disguise itself as curiosity, that deep down we all carry within us a fragment of this duality. The question remains simple and disturbing. Have we learned anything from this? Or do we continue to believe that evil always has an obvious face? As it learns, observes, and reinvents itself, perhaps danger isn't just in isolated places or deserted roads. Perhaps it's within us, at the very point where fear and fascination meet. What if Raphael's true legacy isn't the terror he caused, but the mirror he left behind? A reflection of how easily we are led, how much we let enchantment replace prudence, and how much, even knowing everything, we would still trust. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because this story captivated you, and perhaps sparked the same curiosity that drives those seeking to understand the darker side of the human mind. Stories like this aren't just about crime. They're about us, about what we fear, and about what we choose to see when fear stares back at us. If this kind of content makes you think, questions, and see the world differently, subscribe to our channel. This is where we delve deep into the stories most people would rather forget and transform fear into understanding. Each new video is a new piece of this puzzle that attempts to explain the inexplicable. And tell me one thing, did you make it to the end? Then leave a comment. I'm with you until the end. I want to know who are the ones who don't blink even when the Story gets denser. Oh, and before you leave, there's a video here that adds to this mystery. Click through and stay with me there, because sometimes the next case reveals more than you imagine.